Okay, a pleasant good morning to everyone. And today we'll be looking at the cardiovascular system. Cardiovascular system, of course, relates specifically to the circulation of blood, carrying all the nutrients, removing waste from all over the body itself. Major organ that drives the cardiovascular system is, of course, the heart, and we will be placing a little more emphasis on this organ as we go through the presentation. Okay, so the next slide. So the cardiovascular system, right? Cardiovascular system consists of really two circulations associated with the heart itself. The pulmonary circulation, which refers to the movement of the blood between the heart and the lungs. Pulmonary, of course, whenever we do hear that term, it refers to the lungs. And the systemic circulation, movement of the blood from the heart throughout the entire human body. So where that is concerned, we have to remember that, of course, arteries carry blood from the heart and veins deliver it back to the heart. The only exceptions, of course, are the pulmonary arteries and veins. So do remember that one in terms of an exception. So I have a quick question. Which veins carry oxygenated rich blood? The pulmonary veins or the systemic veins? Which one has oxygen-rich blood? Ah, correct is right. Pulmonary veins. That is correct. Those are the ones that return the blood from the lungs to the heart itself, and they do carry oxygen-rich ones. Now, the pulmonary circulation transfers blood between the heart and the lungs, and the systemic transfers blood between the heart and the other tissues of the body itself. Arteries carry blood from the heart and veins deliver it back to the heart. So when we look at the heart itself, it's really two pumps side by side. One pumps the oxygen poor blood to the lungs, and the other one oxygen rich blood to the rest of the body. So the heart itself, if we look at the location of the heart, it is located in what is known as the mediastinum. Mediastinum is thus an area either side of the midline itself. One of the things we would notice with the apex of the heart, it points to the left, down towards the left hip, and the base points towards the posterior left shoulder. So that is important to take note of. The heart itself is firmly attached to the diaphragm and the major blood vessels by the pericardium. So the pericardium, peri meaning around, cardia referring to the heart, it's a sheath or a nice covering that protects the heart itself. The heart wall contains 3 layers and is surrounded by this protective pericardium. And if I were to ask this question, which layer of the pericardium is part of the heart wall? That answer, of course, will be the visceral layer. So if we look at a little more detail in terms of the heart, and here we'd notice the pericardial cavity and the serous pericardium, well, this visceral layer that is intimate to the myocardium or the muscle of the heart itself. So cardiac muscle, what is very specific, very important to remember when we look at the heart is comprised of cardiac muscle. And the only place you do find cardiac muscle is in the heart itself. Their cells are joined end to end with what are known as intercalated discs. And from SNF1, you would have recognized in terms of looking at the lab slides associated with the cardiac muscle, one of the telling ways to differentiate between certain striated type muscles, right, is to look, when you look at cardiac muscle itself, one of the important things that differentiates it are the presence of those intercalated discs, which are seen as little dark dark little pieces on the slide itself. So that's one way in terms of when you look at a slide to tell the difference between, let's say, cardiac muscle and skeletal muscle, because they're both striated, but of course cardiac has um, these little dark parts, which are the intercalated discs. Now, what is the purpose of gap junctions? To physically hold cells together or to electrically couple cells? And the answer is these gap junctions are very critical for electrically connecting cells together. When we look at the cardiac muscle action potential, all right, so if we look here, the action potential in skeletal muscle cells is a very short duration. The action potential in cardiac muscle cells has an extended plateau. So here we are looking on this side. This is for skeletal muscle, right? Once it reaches threshold, you do have a very quick movement towards depolarization, and the time or period of muscle contraction is short. Whereas when you look at cardiac muscle action potential, once it does get to the threshold point and it shoots up, uh, in terms of depolarization, you notice the time for muscle contraction is indeed longer. So the strength of a cardiac contraction depends on how much calcium is available. Myocardial action potentials last longer than those in skeletal muscles, and calcium, not membrane depolarization, opens the calcium channels in the endoplasmic reticulum. And here we see a very important diagram to take note of, and you should appreciate then how the blood flows through the heart. Let's see if we could follow that direction. So blood return to the heart, and do take note here, this blue coloration, just to let you know it's deoxygenated blood. So blood is returned to the heart, to the right atrium, via the superior and inferior vena cava. The inferior and superior vena cava, they empty into the right atrium. The blood then moves past the right atrioventricular valve into the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, it moves into the, it moves past rather the left, these valves here, and it goes now for oxygenation. So it goes via the pulmonary trunk. Note you have a bifurcation to the either the left or the right lungs. So blood, deoxygenated blood, comes in, right atrium, right ventricle, then via this very important pulmonary artery, and then it goes into the lungs. From there, it is returned via the pulmonary veins. This is oxygen-rich blood. It returns to the left atrium, goes to the left ventricle. Of course, it passes through here, the left atrioventricular valve, AV. And again, the reason why it's called AV is because it is situated between the atria and the ventricle. Now, it is now sent out through the body itself via the aorta. So it's very important to note in terms of this movement of the blood deoxygenated, returning via the systemic, going to the pulmonary circulation to the lungs, and then out via the aorta to the rest of the body itself. So this just shows or speaks to what I just mentioned in terms of the circulation. So when you do have a look at it, it will be very interesting to take note of the different parts and to appreciate how it actually the blood moves throughout the body itself. Now the valves, when you're looking at the skeletal in section, is shown here. So here's the right AV valve and the leaflets of the left AV valve, pulmonary valve, and the aortic valves. Very important to note you have these valves to ensure that you don't have the backflow of blood into the different sections, the atria and ventricles. Also to ensure as well that you do have a buildup of pressure that is sufficient to move the blood through the heart itself. Here we are seeing in terms of the blood flow, and again the chordae tendineae, very important in terms of preventing in this case the valves from turning inside out. This is found in the ventricle as shown. All right, so while the heart is an organ that pumps blood throughout the body, we must remember that there is muscle tissue associated with the heart itself. So therefore, this muscle tissue must receive a circulation in order that it survives. This circulation is shown here in terms of the coronary circulation, and only the major vessels are illustrated here. So in terms of it, here we see the left coronary artery, circumflex artery, anterior interventricular artery, right? This supplies the blood to this portion of the heart, whereas the right coronary artery is within the coronary sulcus as shown here, and then it differentiates or gets smaller and goes to the right marginal artery. So collectively, these arteries they do supply the blood to the heart itself. So this is the anterior view. and the posterior view is shown here. This is the circumflex artery, for those of us so named because it looks like the French circumflex, right? That V-shaped that is used in the French language over certain letters. And here we see the coronary sinus in terms of the venous return of the blood, because we have to remember oxygenated blood is brought to the heart, but once used by the cardiac cells, the deoxygenated blood has to be returned as well to the systemic circulation. So this is done via these veins shown here. This shows the breakdown, the aorta. From the aorta itself, the right coronary artery is a branch of the aorta, both the right and the left coronary artery. The right coronary artery, it goes further divided into the right marginal artery and the posterior interventricular artery, whereas the left coronary artery is divided into the circumflex and the anterior interventricular arteries itself. Now, this is just showing a complete cardiac cycle. Now, the cardiac cycle, or which is a single heartbeat, can be divided into three stages. One, open valves, which are shown here in green. Closed valves are red. Green arrows, which are shown, so this is the red here. Green arrows are pressure gradients that result in blood flow. So if we look very carefully, we would notice those arrows, and it shows the blood pressure flow. The red arrows are pressure gradients that do not result in blood flow. So it's very important to take note of it in terms of the movement of the blood itself. One, for atrial systole, you do have the relaxation, ventricular diastole. The semilunar valves are closed. The atrioventricular valves open and flow from the atria to the ventricles occur. Then secondly, the ventricular systole, when the ventricles squeeze, you have atrial diastole, they at rest, the semilunar valves open, the atrioventricular valves close, and flow from the ventricles to the great vessels occur. Then finally, in terms of complete diastole, the complete or the finishing, you have the semilunar valves are closed, the AV valves are open and flow from the atria occurs to the ventricles. So this is shown here on the diagram. Two words which we were introduced to and is important to remember. Systole means contraction, and of course diastole, remember, is relaxation. So, systole itself sounds like squeeze, so always remember to link those two in terms of remembering them. All right, so this is just showing the cardiac conduction system in terms of the action potential. Not too much of this is on the syllabus, so we wouldn't spend too much time on that. For the cardiac conduction system, now it is important to remember that for the heart to effectively contract in the systolic phase and relax as well in the diastolic phase due to no inputs via the nervous system associated with the heart itself, we must appreciate that the heart has a very intricate nervous system which allows for the distribution of the action potentials to the muscles of the heart, which collectively facilitate or allow systole and diastole to happen. Let's see how this is done. First of all, the SA node, that's where it all starts. The sinoatrial node, it initiates the signal. The signal passes through the atria, stimulating contraction. Have to remember that once electrical impulses in the form of action potential reach muscle, in this case, cardiac muscle, that allows contraction to occur. Next, the AV node delays the signal. That is very important because we have to remember that you have a difference between systoles. When systole occurs, atrial systole, then a pause, then you have ventricular systole. It doesn't happen all the time. Then you have the atrioventricular bundle carries the signal through the fibrous skeleton or fibrous skeleton to the interventricular septum. The bundle branch conveys the signal to the apex. Purkinje fibers carry signal through the ventricle, stimulating contraction from the bottom upwards. So therefore, when the signal reaches here, you do have contraction. There is a delay in terms of the signal to ensure that systole, atrial systole occurs initially. And then when relaxation occurs, you then have ventricular systole occurring. So all conducting cells are autorhythmic and most fire action potential as a result of the action potentials in a neighboring cell. So it's only when that initial signal sent from the SA node is passed along do you have subsequent action potentials generated along the conduction pathway, which leads to the contraction of subsequent areas, causing ventricular systole to occur after atrial systole is initiated. So this is just showing an electrocardiogram. An electrocardiogram shows it is a measure of the electrical activity associated with the heart itself. Different electrodes are placed around the heart and they record the electrical activity of the heart. Very important to take note here in terms of the electrical activity. The systole, the atrial systole, as shown here, occurs before the ventricular systole in terms of their occurrences. Here you have the resting period, the diastole, then the systole is initiated once more. All right, and then you have here the action potential is passed along to the ventricular area, leading to ventricular systole. So the cardiac output, take note of this formula. The cardiac output is a volume of blood ejected per minute by the left ventricle into the aorta. It measures the total amount of blood flow in the body itself and is very given by this formula, heart rate times the stroke volume. In a healthy person, the cardiac output is about 5 liters per minute. This means that the entire blood volume circulates through the body about once per minute. Output changes, of course, to meet changing demands itself. Now, the heart, how is the heart innervated? Well, the vasomotor center controls the heart rate and force of cardiac muscle contraction. The sympathetic fibers here, shown in green, and the parasympathetic fibers are shown in red in terms of their innervative pathways. Now I have a question. Which branch of the autonomic nervous system does not pass through the spinal cord? The sympathetic or the parasympathetic? Correct, and that answer would be the parasympathetic, because here we're seeing the sympathetic passing through the spinal cord. The parasympathetic does not pass through the spinal cord. So the parasympathetic system determines the vagal tone, and it suppresses the SA firing to about 75 discharges per minute in a healthy adult. Okay, so blood vessels now. We look at the heart, and now we'll just speak to the microanatomy of blood vessels. So while we have completed the heart, then let's move on to the other topic, the microanatomy of blood vessels itself. When we look at the two major types of blood vessels, we have the arteries and the veins. Connecting the arteries to the veins are the capillary bed. So not bread, but the capillary bed. The arteries, they differentiate or get smaller, and when they do so, they are known as arterioles. The veins get smaller, and they're known as venules. So the venules connect to the capillary bed, and the arterioles also connect to the capillary bed. Important to note that the capillaries, they're one cell thick, so they're very narrow. So gaseous exchange could occur across the walls of the capillary itself. That is important to take note of. When you look at the arteries and veins, we could see some differences related to the thickness. One of the major differences, of course, is the tunica media. With the artery, it is a lot thicker than the vein itself. The lumen, or the space as well, with arteries is shown here. With the vein, it tends to be a little shown here, that's on the larger side, because of the fact the muscular artery has a thicker wall associated with it. All right, so the muscular arteries, this just speaks to the blood vessels, so the pressure associated with the arteries and the vein. So during vasoconstriction and vasodilation, this is just showing what happens in terms of that. The smooth muscles of the tunica media, they contract or relax to alter the lumen diameter. So it's because of the movement of that tunica media do you have this change in the diameter of the lumen. So the lumen is under the direct control then of the tunica media motion. So I have a question for you. Now, nitric oxide releases or relaxes vascular smooth muscle. Would nitric oxide increase or decrease blood flow? So if nitric oxide relaxes vascular smooth muscle, well, the answer would be it would be to increase. So because of the fact the vascular smooth muscle found in the veins and the arteries themselves, they would then be sensitive to the nitric oxide. So since the nitric oxide would relax it, it would increase the diameter and therefore the blood flow would increase subsequently. So this is us showing the capillary bed in terms of the connection between arteries and veins. This is the capillary bed. We don't have to get into, for this course, too much detail where that is concerned. So the capillary exchange, just to take note of it, but again, we do not have to, for this course, get into very great detail. In terms of the movement, suffice it for this course to know that the movement could occur by a simple diffusion between the cells, particularly gaseous exchange. We'll talk more about that when we're looking at respiration. But that is about the major thing to note about capillary walls. Also to note then that you could have movements between the cells of the capillary walls. It's bulk flow or movement determined by the balance. This bulk flow or movement determined, of course, by the hydrostatic pressures on either side. But do take note, the capillary walls are indeed leaky and they do allow things to move through them. So this is then showing the blood flow and the movement which occurs as a result of it in terms of exchange across the capillary walls. Okay, so we spoke about the heart. We looked at two major vessels that move the blood throughout the body, veins and the arteries, and by extension, you have the venules and the arterioles, smaller section. Of course, they interchange or they exchange their contents within the capillary bed itself. So the other thing in terms of the veins specifically, how do veins actually move blood? Because one of the things we would have noticed when we're looking at the tunica media or the muscle associated with veins is a lot thinner than in arteries. So whereas the arteries could contract in and of themselves and then move along the blood that is within it, veins, well, they can't really do that exceptionally efficiently because of the fact that the muscle layer, the tunica media, is thin. So how do they do it? So one of the major ways that blood with veins are usually associated with muscles. And for instance, this is a very important one. This is showing gastrocnemius muscle, right? And in terms of the blood flow here, when you do have the contraction of the muscle, in this case, the gastrocnemius muscle, you do have return of the blood is squeezed. So then the blood is really using the cardiac muscle as an assister, as a help, as an aid, as it were, to move that blood along its length. All right, so this speaks to the blood pressures in terms of systolic and diastolic pressures. All right, and this shows then the pressures associated with the systemic circulation. So in terms of determinants of blood pressure, the arterial blood pressure is determined by two major things. One is the blood volume, and the next thing is vessel compliance. Vessel compliance, of course, refers to the ability of the blood vessel to sustain pressure, and of course, before of expanding as a result of the introduction of a greater volume or increase in pressure. So in that way, the compliance refers to this movement associated with greater pressure, right? So therefore it would bulge out, and a greater volume, then you would have a similar movement occurring. All right, so this is what is referring here is known in terms of the baroreceptor reflex. Now, when you do have blood loss, a significant amount of blood loss from some type of trauma, what you have happening is, of course, bleeding with a loss of volume, it reduces the blood volume and the blood pressure. Now, the baroreceptors or the pressure receptors, the firing rate of these pressure receptors, they slow in response to the decreased blood volume. Now, the vasomotor center within the brain itself, it increases the sympathetic activity. So increased sympathetic activity leads to the activation of the tunica media, and it causes then a decrease in the lumal diameter. So the arterioles, here you're seeing it, in response to this blood loss behind the arteries, they actually narrow. The heart rate and contractility in terms of the heart, increased sympathetic motor nerve activity, decrease in the arterioles, but then you have increase in the contractility to the heart itself. So therefore, the signal sent to the heart are increased, the diameter of the arteries decrease, and this leads to an increased cardiac output. So the increased resistance, right, brought about by the action of the stimulation from the vasomotor center on the arterioles, it increases the resistance. You have an increase in cardiac output via the stimulation, and this collectively increases your blood pressure. So therefore, a maintenance of the blood pressure, irrespective of the fact that you do have a change in blood volume. Now, of course, you could have some issues arising from increased blood pressure, and this is known as hypertension, the silent killer, because there are no real symptoms associated with it. So when you do have a sustained high blood pressure, right, a sustained high blood pressure, this is known as hypertension. Now, the optimum blood pressure, of course, is 180, 120 over 80, systolic diastolic relationship. But with prehypertension, you have persistent readings above it. In fact, readings between 120 over 80 and 140 over 90 itself. Of course, using the sphygmomanometer, you could measure it. And if you find that you have a consistently high reading, this could point to, of course, hypertension. Okay, and this is a case here in terms of Bob, and you could have a look at it in when you do have time to review it. All right. So the final thing we want to talk about is the portal circulation. So notwithstanding the systemic and the pulmonary circulation, the portal circulation is any circulatory pathway that includes two capillary beds, one that drains into another, such as the venous return from the intestine. So the portal, very important in terms of moving nutrients, from the intestines themselves. The anastomosis is a union of two or more blood vessels by a vessel larger than a capillary. Example, the left coronary gives rise to the posterior descending coronary artery, and these provide an alternative route for blood delivery if one small branch is occluded. So we'll just speak to the major systemic and arteries and veins as shown here. So here we have, of course, the aorta coming out of the heart itself, and the major divisions. You have the brachiocephalic trunk, subclavian artery, the axillary artery, radial artery, going down to the arms themselves, the femoral, so named because of the presence of the femur, its proximity to it. You have the deep femoral artery, and coming down here, you have the posterior tibial, again named due to its proximity to the tibia itself, and the dorsalis pedis arteries down to the within the foot itself. This, of course, is also used as a pulse point. And then you have the veins, the major veins coming out or returning the blood to the heart itself. You have the subclavian internal external jugular vein. You have the brachial, cephalic, and basilic veins within the arm itself. The palmar and digital veins. Coming down, you have the femoral, the popliteal, which is located right behind the knee, anterior tibial, posterior, and of course the plantar venous arch and the dorsal venous arch. So here, for convenience, they're colored blue, but most definitely blood is never blue. It's always red or shades of it. All right, so that's it for the cardiovascular system. We looked at the artery, we looked at the major organ, the heart, then we looked at the blood vessels, which actually supply the heart as well. All right, I hope it was useful and that you did enjoy it. And do remember, most critically, to appreciate movement of the blood through the heart. All of these things, in terms of sustaining life, usually done in terms of the volume on average, so between 4 to 5 liters. Okay, you have a great day.